and the other is through the capital flows. The exports of the developing economies are to a very large extent to the developed countries. And as incomes come down, or as the income growth slows down in the developed economies, it has an impact upon the exports of the developing economies. Secondly, as the risk perception increases in the developed world, it has an impact upon the capital flows into the emerging markets also. How do we get out of this situation? How can the emerging economies manage in this situation where the developed economies have a growth which is slowing down? Perhaps some of the choices that were open to us in 2008 are perhaps not open to us at this present moment. For example, in the wake of the 2008 crisis, almost every country in the world adopted an expansionary fiscal and monetary policy. But 3 years down the line, the fiscal deficits of almost every country has increased and the debt GDP ratio has grown up. In this context, the maneuverability or the space for an expansionary fiscal policy is getting limited. So the question arises, what are the means and what are the manner in which the developing economies can take care of themselves? It has also been argued that countries which have been extremely dependent upon exports to drive their economies, to drive the growth of the economies, must turn to domestic demand. Therefore, diversion or conversion of the export demand or the external demand to domestic demand has been regarded as one of the important ways in which the developing economies can find a means, can find a way for promoting economic growth. To what extent is this possible? Can a regional grouping of developing economies which are growing fast possible? So there are many ways or many channels through which the developing economies can be, can raise the rate of growth, can continue to grow at a high level, at a high rate, despite what is happening in the rest of the world. We have a distinguished panel this afternoon to enlighten us on what the emerging economies can do in the context of a world economic situation in which the growth is slowing down, particularly in the advanced countries. I would now therefore request the panelists to make their comments. I would suggest that each panelist take no more than 10 minutes to convey their views, so that it will give at least about half an hour after the presentation for the participants to raise questions. May I first request Ms. Chanda Kochhar to make her observations. As it was already mentioned, Ms. Chanda Kochhar is the Chief Executive Officer of the ICICI Bank, the leading private sector bank in this country. Chanda.
Dr. Rangarajan, distinguished co-panelists, ladies and gentlemen, I indeed feel very privileged to be amongst all of you here today and really to share the dais with esteemed academicians and with Dr. Rangarajan himself, who is a legend in economic policy making. I think the topic of today's discussion is in a way very timely, where India itself is sitting at this crossroads where it has a huge cusp of opportunities and at the same time is also facing a set of challenges that need to be addressed in order to realize our country's potential. I think in the morning we've discussed a lot about the challenges that are being faced by the developed economies, and I would not go into that at all. I would, as per the topic of this discussion, come straight to the emerging economies and actually focus even more on India. So the emerging economies actually have still been witnessing robust growth over the past 2 decades, and they've emerged to become formidable growth engines for the world. There are certain advantages that the emerging economies have, which is of cheap resources available for production, and that provides cost arbitrage benefits. They've also expended considerable effort in improving factor productivity. They've leveraged their domestic advantages, and actually, they've all started pursuing an export-led model of growth, driven mainly either by industry or manufacturing or services. I think a favorable consequence of this for many emerging economies has been that they do enjoy surpluses on their current account, they have decent and healthy fiscal positions. However, the challenge is that the export-led growth model means that the indirect impact of whatever happens in the developed economy really becomes stronger and stronger for the emerging economies as we go forward. And therefore, even if we look at China, I think while the exports have been growing, but it is an economic model that is largely dependent on exports and investments, and it's really very relatively low domestic consumption. So I think emerging economies will find it difficult to fully insulate themselves from the consequence of a global crisis. And actually, a recent development in the recent years further has been inflationary impact of the loose monetary policies in the West, with excess liquidity finding its ways into commodities, currencies, instead of investment and consumption. And this will further and further complicate the fiscal and monetary policies in the emerging economies. While emerging economies do still have some headroom for maneuvering, that is, they have high forex reserves, but to keep managing a comfortable situation in the as has been in the past is going to be a bigger and bigger challenge. But if I focus, specifically on India, I think India is even different compared to many other emerging economies. There are certain strengths which India has which other economies do not have. The first strength that India has is a very strong reliance on domestic consumption. So unlike many other economies which are much more dependent on exports, we have a very, very strong domestic consumption-led growth model. The second advantage is that all the investments that we make in India are in a way backed by huge demand. So in India, we do not invest in capital expenditure just for the sake of propping up the economy, but we actually invest because there is a huge demand that is forcing investment. So as the projects start, commercial production, there's a huge demand that is anyway waiting, and we do not really have to wait and hope that our roads, our bridges, etc. get utilized after they are set up. I think there's always a pending demand that is pending. And I think these two things really give a huge resilience to the Indian economy. Of course, over and above that, our country has the demographic advantages, which are probably the best compared to many other emerging economies, because while many other emerging economies, including China, will start aging from now, India will remain a relatively young economy for many years to come. And according to UN's projections, India is likely to contribute about 26% of the increase in global workforce in the coming years. So I think that's a huge advantage that India has. Over and above that, we have many other strengths. We have a vibrant and a competitive market economy. We have a flourishing entrepreneurial talent. We have healthy and strong banking sector, which is well placed to serve the needs of both consumers and producers in the economy. And we have strong regulatory institutions. We also have substantial natural resources, which we actually ought to use judiciously in order to leverage growth. However, there is some challenges which are also specific to us and which are bigger for us compared to other emerging economies. The first of it is the presence of twin deficits. We have a current account deficit and a fiscal deficit. And of course, we have structurally high inflation. And these things severely constrain the headroom for policymakers. So I think, and inflation, of course, comes from several factors. It's oil prices, it's domestic wage inflation, lower than desired investment in capacity creation, lower than desired productivity improvement, and so on. So given this set of challenges and given the huge opportunities, what should be the priorities for economic policy making in India? Well, I would list down 6 priorities which we as a nation should follow. The first should be growth in investment and capital formation. Secondly, improving and rebalancing agricultural output. Third, control over fiscal deficit. Fourth, improvement in education and skill building. Fifth, growth in foreign investment. And sixth, making our growth inclusive. So when we talk of investment and capital formation, I mean, India, no doubt, is an infrastructure deficit country and requires huge investments through public as well as private sector. We also have various natural resources, as I said, but building quality infrastructure has multitude implications in terms of improved productivity and finally in ability to control inflation as well. I mean, if we just take a simple example, of, say, the port sector. You know, the turnaround time for containers at India's largest container port is about 2.5 days, whereas for Hong Kong, it's just about 10 hours. And there are smaller ports in India where also we have reached a level of 15 hours. So I think we have to work towards making infrastructure investment not just possible, but making them productive and making them deliver the required results for the country. Secondly, increasing agricultural output. While the agriculture sector has been growing at 3 to 4% annually, it has definitely not managed to keep pace with the rising demand of the large consuming class, the larger, not just the growing population, but the growing incomes, growing aspirations, and the structural change in the consumption patterns in India. And it's really the supply side constraints that have kept food inflation at elevated levels. So this sector requires large government intervention to improve productivity, as well as private sector participation in food processing, value chain management, and so on. The third, talking of fiscal consolidation, I must first say that considering the stage of development we are in, of course, large income disparities, huge investment needs, I think fiscal deficits would be a given for us for some time to come. However, persistently high fiscal deficits can have implications in terms of preempting domestic savings and liquidity, keeping interest rates high and keeping inflation high. And therefore, we will, as a priority, have to get the fiscal house back in order. And I think tax revenues are one of the more stable sources to the budget, and some long-term measures could be considered here, like a speedy implementation of goods and services tax, etc., which will help reduce the deficits and support revenues. Talking about the fourth priority, that is education and skill building, I think India is really again at a crossroads where we talk of a huge demographic dividend that the country enjoys. However, in order to harness this demographic dividend, we have to make sure that we educate our people and not just educate them, but train them and develop skills so that they become employable and they start contributing to the economy. So I think a huge focus on education and skill development is absolutely necessary for us to be able to harness the demographic dividend. The fifth priority in terms of foreign investment, well, I think in the current circumstances where we are running a current account deficit and a fiscal deficit, and our domestic investment spending is actually slowing down, the need for foreign capital is evident. But again, what we have to ensure is that as the flow of foreign capital is encouraged, we ensure that that flow goes into the right investments of capacity creation and does not get diverted into creating asset bubbles. And clearly, as per policies, that's how we will have to direct foreign investment. And the other point is that we may or may not need many big policy reforms here, but even within the sectors where foreign investment is allowed, I think it's really important for us to create a policy environment which is conducive to investment so that it encourages foreign investment to come even in sectors where it's currently allowed. And finally, of course, I would say that making growth inclusive is really, again, a very imperative part of our policy making. And again, when we talk of making growth inclusive, inclusive growth is not just restricted to financial inclusion as is mainly talked about or generally talked about. I think to make growth inclusive, we have to start from the basics. We have to make sure that we educate the people in the rural areas, that we provide the basic health facilities so that they are able to gain education, that we train them for basic skills and make them employable, and then we provide employment opportunities or income earning opportunities closer to where they live. And finally, of course, we provide financial inclusion so that banking and other facilities are available to them. So I think it has to be a comprehensive approach towards making growth inclusive, which will not just help more and more people participate in growth, but in a way catalyze the economic growth of the country. So I think I would end by saying that as a bank CEO, I'm often asked, how do you navigate through these uncertain times? And my answer, I try to oversimplify it, and I always say that it's important for us to play to our strengths. We focus on our core objectives, we focus on our core franchise, and we fill in the gaps in our capabilities, and of course we manage the day-to-day volatilities on a day-to-day basis while keeping the focus on our long-term goals. Now, I do not want to oversimplify and say that managing an economy is going to be as simple, but I think the message I would leave behind is that while it's a very, very complex task, but the overriding principle remains the same, that we as a nation should focus on our strengths, should play on our strengths, and work towards filling the gaps in our capabilities. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Chanda, for a very crisp statement on what needs to be done in order to promote economic growth in India. May I now request Professor Klaus Zimmermann to make his comments. As you know, he is currently the Professor of Economics at Bonn University. He is also the President of the European Society for Population Economics.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to be here on this important event and contribute with the eyes from an European observer of the world. In my view, any successful economic government policies at this time have to deal with three issues. We have to stabilize the macroeconomic environment. We have to foster economic growth, and in particular, we have to strengthen the adaptability of the economies to react to economic shocks. We have to be prepared for the next crisis. So I don't think we have a solution how to avoid crises, but we may be able to learn and to better adapt in the next crisis. I think that's the central issue. Some of the ideas in my presentation here were also already published in op-eds in the Financial Express and Economic Times of India. Let me start with some remarks on the consequences of the Great Recession, because each crisis is, so to speak, feeded by the last crisis. And the last crisis was a deep one, starting in particular sectors in many advanced economies, in particular on housing markets and financial markets. As a reaction to that big crisis, we have